Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America, and today I'm joined by Abraham Denmark. Abraham Denmark is a partner at the Asia Group and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the Biden administration, where he led and coordinated Department of Defense efforts to implement the Australia-United Kingdom-U.S. partnership, focusing on submarine production and development and fielding of advanced capabilities. Abe, thank you for coming on to Eye on Korea.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
And I just want to start with really your time at DoD overseeing AUKUS and the role that AUKUS plays as part of the lattice work of the broader Indo-Pacific strategy. How would you describe the arc of development of the Indo-Pacific strategy under the Biden administration and what has been bequeathed to the second Trump administration? What have they inherited? And how did things change while you were at DoD?
Yeah, so I think what occurred during the Biden administration was a dramatic strengthening of U.S. alliances and partnerships across the region, especially in the political and military spheres. We saw in Japan, in Korea, across the region really with Australia, a real broadening and deepening of American engagement, of our posture, of our activities across the region. And AUKUS was, I think, an important part of that, but I often also try to emphasize the Quad, the Squad, all the other various trilaterals that came through, as well as the dramatic changes to some of our military posture, especially in Japan and Australia, which I think is quite important. And I think the Biden administration should be proud in leaving the American power in the Indo-Pacific is quite robust, especially when it comes to our alliances, our partnerships, and our military posture in the region.
And since you were working directly on AUKUS, I wonder if you can say a little bit about the significance of AUKUS really as a driver for changing thinking about cooperation in the context of the defense industrial base.
So it's a really good question, and it's, I think, a very important element that often gets overlooked about AUKUS. AUKUS was created really in a way that could, if we do it right, fundamentally change how we do defense industrial cooperation. Now, I started my career actually in the U.S. intelligence community, where there's a Five Eyes relationship that is really fundamental to how the United States conducts its intelligence analysis and collection. And that's really part of the DNA of how our intelligence works. That is not how things work in defense industrial cooperation. I remember my first day in the job, I tried to send a classified email to one of my counterparts in the UK, and the email bounced back because we didn't have that kind of communication channels open. We don't have the same kind of collaboration in the defense industry as we do in other sectors. So if we do AUKUS right, I believe it can become as fundamental to how we do defense industrial cooperation as Five Eyes is to our intelligence community now.
And so that's really what I want to get at. AUKUS was such a unique and I think cutting-edge sort of development that has potential implications for other allies. And of course, you mentioned Five Eyes, and Japan and Korea are sitting outside of that. But what are your thoughts about the way in which this might be applicable in the context of the lattice work that was so often mentioned in the Biden administration? And what does that mean in terms of the ways in which countries like Japan and Korea might be expected to engage with the United States in that context?
So AUKUS is divided into two pillars, right? Pillar one is the cooperation on nuclear-powered submarines, and that's going to remain trilateral. I think the chances of that involving other countries are about zero. The other pillar two, though, is focused on other elements of advanced defense technology, including maritime autonomy, cyber, quantum technology, and it's in that area that I believe there's room for cooperation among the other allies and partners in the region, and really in other parts of the world. The key, though, is we want to make sure that, I think it's important to make sure that AUKUS remains high level so that you're not dragging things down to accommodate other countries. So I think that's going to require other countries like Japan and Korea, as you mentioned, to really up their game when it comes to information security, when it comes to defense industry collaboration, and figuring out what it is that they can bring to the table that makes sense for quadrilateral cooperation. If they have something that they can bring to the table that the other partners are interested in, that they'd be able to feel that would benefit each country, then I think there's a lot of potential there, both for Japan, for Korea, for other countries. But it's a high bar, and it shouldn't be seen, though, as exclusive of other forms of collaboration. If there's opportunities for defense industrial cooperation, be it bilateral, trilateral, some other configuration of countries, I don't think AUKUS should be seen as limiting that kind of cooperation. It's just a unique element of how we do defense and cooperation. It's a very high level, but doesn't necessarily mean that it should stop other elements of defense industrial collaboration if that's what makes sense. Yeah.
So that means we should really focus on Pillar 2. But I have to ask you, because recently there's been talk about a JROCUS cooperation on nuclear submarine development, obviously non-official, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
So I think it would be very hard to do. The United States has only shared its information about very sensitive naval nuclear propulsion capabilities and technologies twice in our history, once with the United Kingdom in the 1950s and now with Australia through AUKUS. And that is very sensitive technologies. And I think the bar for that is extremely high. And I think it would be difficult for any country to get to. And it's actually requiring a lot of effort by Australia to get to those efforts, despite them being in Five Eyes, despite the robust defense relationship we already have with them. It's requiring them to raise their bar even more than they'd been at before. The other piece of it, though, is if you take a step back from sort of the functions and mechanics of AUKUS, is the strategic logic that Australia made a strategic decision that they needed long-range strike capabilities to hold potential adversaries at risk at distance from the Australian mainland. And the United States and the UK agreed with that and saw their need for nuclear-powered submarines as a critical piece of that strategy. What we haven't seen from other countries like Japan and Korea that you mentioned is that strategic argument about why nuclear-powered submarines would be helpful as part of their military strategy, in part because their defense threats that they're facing, either real or potential, are so much closer than the United States faces, than Australia faces, and the United Kingdom faces. I think it's a harder element to overcome, but I also think that it's important to have these sorts of conversations with allies like Japan and Korea to figure out what it is specifically, the kind of capabilities that they do need to address the threats that they face, and how our industries can collaborate more effectively in order to meet their challenges as well as those faced by the United States.
Okay, that's great. We've addressed Pillar 1 and now Pillar 2. I guess the question I have is, should Japan and South Korea be looking for ways to get in under the tent with AUKUS, or should they really be, thinking about the other ways in which defense industrial production thinking is changing, like under the National Defense Industrial Strategy? There are bilateral conversations. We had the National Security Advisor-led discussion as related to cooperation on advanced technologies with Japan and South Korea that included areas like AI and quantum. What's the right point of entry for that conversation to occur between the U.S. and South Korea?
So 2 points. I think first is there's an inherent, I believe, geopolitical benefit for having these countries as part of AUKUS in terms of the signal that it sends to the rest of the world. And in terms of how it binds our countries more closely together than they were before. So I think there's a fundamental argument about why this would be a good thing to do. But that said, I'm very concerned. Well, I shouldn't say very concerned. I would want to be careful to make sure that AUKUS does not get in the way or complicate these very important discussions. So if it were up to me, I would have questions about whether or not AUKUS should be a part of that towards the back end of these discussions. So first talking bilaterally about how we can improve our defense cooperation capabilities, what kind of technologies we should collaborate together, how that would work. And only once you figure out maybe the 3 or 4 areas where cooperation may make the most sense bilaterally, should we then talk about, okay, would that make sense in an AUKUS context? Would that make sense in another trilateral context? Because it's easy to get wrapped around the axle in AUKUS. And the last point I'd make is nothing has ever been made easier by adding more countries to it. Right. So there's a complication involved in bringing in AUKUS to this. I think there's a lot of benefits for it that makes it worth it. But I would want to make sure that there's a bilateral agreement that this is a good thing to do, and then have that conversation about whether or not AUKUS should be a part of that.
Okay. And of course, the big question that's on everybody's minds is under the Trump administration, what is the future of AUKUS? What is the future of defense cooperation in the context of a highly transactional approach to alliance partners?
Yeah. So I think taken as as sort of an intellectual exercise, I expect that AUKUS would be very attractive to the people that are in the president's circle, in that it advances American military interests. It provides us with new posture options in terms of us operating out of a very important submarine facility in Western Australia. And it also provides for greater defense industrial cooperation that involves Australia putting billions of dollars into the United States industrial base. And that's in addition to the cost of actually purchasing the submarines that we've agreed to. So I think there's a lot of obvious benefits to those pieces. The questions, I think, are, at least on Pillar 1, are surrounding a few things. One is that the Trump administration is taking a fundamental reexamination of American shipbuilding more broadly. That involves commercial as well as naval. And Pillar 1 gets kind of pulled into that. Based on my conversations with them, I think there's things look pretty good. In terms of their support for AUKUS. They see the value of it, but I think it's a continual conversation that's going to need to happen. The second piece that I'd highlight is on Pillar 2. I actually think there's a lot of enthusiasm for Pillar 2 in the Trump team, and that they see a lot of potential benefit for it, but there needs to be tangible progress. I believe that we have about 18 months in order to examine what's going on in Pillar 2 and get some tangible progress going. Before people start asking real questions about whether or not Pillar 2 is fundamentally viable. That's enough time to get an agreement going, but I do think that there needs to be some urgency going on in Pillar 2. The last point I'd make, I think there's a President Trump assumption that needs to go into all these conversations, right? And this is not exclusive to AUKUS. This is pretty much involves all elements of our foreign policy and national security policy, which is because he's so mercurial and because his positions can shift very quickly from one extreme to another, that even if he says, yes, AUKUS is fantastic, it's the greatest thing ever, that's no guarantee that in a month or 2 months or a year or whatever it may be, his position may change. So I think that means for Americans, for Australians, for Brits, for Koreans, for Japanese, it means constant engagement, constant re-engagement on these issues to make sure the strategic case is being made, the economic case is being made, and to get any hints of that positions may be shifting so that countries, that other folks can have the arguments ready to ensure a steady approach as best we can, given the uncertainties that are, I think, fundamental with President Trump at the helm.
So the other dimension of that I think must be really challenging, and of course you've been traveling, is the adjustment from a values-based framework to a transactional framework. So what are you telling people about how to deal with this focus on transactionalism? And in particular, what would you advise to Northeast Asian allies? Because it kind of seems like they've been watching the show, but it hasn't really necessarily arrived right on their front door yet. What's your advice to Northeast Asian allies and partners on that?
So I don't advise foreign governments, but my general sense, they've been watching this very closely. And I think the positive thing, if one can find a positive thing about transactionalism, is that it's a very clear dynamic that you come to the plate, you come to the table with negotiation, you give, you take, and you find an agreement. I think with the recent announcement of blanket tariffs, that really complicates things. But it also, I think, drives the need for engagement amongst our allies with the United States, especially with the Trump team, to figure out how to navigate these issues on the assumption that there is a negotiation to be had, right? In terms of transactionalism, I think there's going to be some lessons learned from our allies, from our partners. They're really, the way I've been thinking about it, working with my colleagues at the Asia Group, is that countries in the Indo-Pacific are really falling into three buckets in how they're engaging with this. There's retaliation, and I think the Chinese are the main folks on that, especially when it comes to tariffs. There's negotiation, where they see this as a part of a negotiation. They try to engage with the Trump team and figure out what the deal is to be had. And I think that quickly gets out of the trade space and potentially involves some defense and national security aspects into figuring out what a comprehensive deal is, especially for a country like with Korea that has a free trade agreement in place. And then there's adaptation, where I think some smaller countries, especially in Southeast Asia, they don't really have the capacity to retaliate. They don't really have the size and scale to create an effective negotiation with the United States. So they adapt and figure out how they can navigate the twos and fro's by engaging the United States, engaging the Chinese, and finding a way through. But my expectation is that with our allies and our partners, especially Korea, Japan, is to pursue a negotiation, to put non-economic pieces on the table, and find a deal that President Trump would find acceptable, that brings some more stability and predictability to the relationship.
I want to switch gears a little bit and ask about foreign military sales and the extent to which that can get in the way of our efforts to coordinate on collective defense capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. Do you see a tension there, or it seems like that sometimes there's a focus on the sales part of it at the expense of the strategy part of it?
Yeah. So foreign military sales is a incredibly complex and frustrating process for all involved, right? I myself have been very frustrated with some of those elements over the years. And it can be a frustrating process when it comes out of sync with our broader strategic aims. My understanding is that there's some folks in the Trump administration who are looking to revise the foreign military sales process, to which I think a lot of people would be supportive. If there's a process involved that's faster, more responsive, but doesn't lose the quality of oversight that is required by Congress, I think that's something that most folks would appreciate. The challenge, though, is when it falls out of sync with broader geopolitical aims, which happens all the time. But it comes to, I think it speaks to some broader elements. Sometimes allies and partners will point to foreign military sales as a frustration when the frustration is actually about export control regime problems or availability of defense articles that have been agreed to be sold, but there's just not enough of them. So sometimes it's important to disaggregate where the frustration's actually coming from. But overall, I think FMS is an important element of American strategy and foreign policy, and something that requires a lot of attention. And if we can make it more responsive, more efficient, all the better.
And I also want to ask you about South Korean defense export or South Korean defense efforts by companies to integrate themselves more into the production chain. And I think that is evident in the context of some of the shipbuilding conversations. Really, South Korean efforts to develop or advertise their technology as an important piece of being able to have effective alliance-based production and capacity to produce to meet demand in the context of especially sudden conflict or the ongoing situation with Ukraine. is one that comes to mind as the driver for this.
Right. So let me talk about shipbuilding first and then more generally. So I worked very closely with Carlos Del Toro when he was Secretary of the Navy, and he obviously had some very productive engagements with the South Koreans when it came to shipbuilding in the Port of Philadelphia. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential here. Both from an American perspective, we need help. Our shipbuilding capability, both civilian and military, is insufficient for demands that we have. And this is something that the Trump administration is really focused on with establishing a shipbuilding office at the NSC and with sponsoring or supporting the SHIPS Act in the U.S. Congress, which I think would address a lot of this. The key, I think, from an American perspective is to create markets that are attractive for South Korean investment, South Korean engagement. South Korea brings a lot of great know-how, technology that the United States, frankly, doesn't have. So I think there's a real need for the United States to engage with South Korean companies and attract them to make investments to help our shipbuilding, both on the civilian and the military side, because we need it, both in terms of our lack of capacity, our lack of productivity, but also the demand that we have for potential conflicts coming out in the Indo-Pacific. Now, more broadly, I think, again, South Korea brings a lot of potential in terms of production capacity when it comes to munitions, when it comes to uncrewed systems, and beyond this, the production capacity that South Korea can bring, there's a lot of great technology that the ROK has developed. And so the ROK being a more active player in the regional and the global arms market and potentially exporting some of these capabilities, I think is a positive development so long as the capabilities are done in a way that allows for interoperability with American and allied forces, which I believe they would be, but also in a way that those exports are done in a way that supports American interests in terms of nonproliferation, stability, and building up the capabilities of our allies and partners in a way that really helps enhance deterrence and enhance allied warfighting should that be necessary.
Well, thanks for that. We also covered a little bit on shipbuilding with Steve Brock recently on an Eye on Korea episode. But I want to talk to you a little bit more. This is our last question, really. You mentioned munitions, uncrewed systems. Are there other specific areas that you see in the defense sector where South Korea may be emerging as a desirable partner, or where South Korean industry may be looking to engage with the U.S. side in ways that might involve production here domestically?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of just focusing on the defense sector, regardless of the tremendous civilian opportunities that there are between the ROK and the United States. Obviously, I mentioned shipbuilding and uncrewed systems. By uncrewed systems, I think it's important to break out. There's surface, there's subsurface, there's aerial capabilities, all of which I think the ROK brings a lot to the table. Beyond that, I think there's potential to play in other capabilities that the United States is developing domestically. Korea has a very good capabilities in terms of land forces. I was at the most recent Land Forces Defense Trade Show in Melbourne, Australia, and the ROK had the most significant displays amongst any other country at land forces. So they obviously bring a lot to the table in terms of those capabilities. And there's a production element there that the ROK can only produce so much. And if demand gets to a point where they need to figure out defense production beyond the ROK, I think there's a lot of opportunity there in the U.S. as well.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface, and yet we've come to the end of our episode. I want to thank you, Abe, for joining us today. And I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media, or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.